welcome to the show. My name's Merlin Fulcher and it's Monday the 18th of May. So, been thinking a lot about imagination and how we're going to need a lot of imagination both to get through this crisis and also to build the kind of sustainable, resilient society that we're going to need as we move through it. Now, imagination, particularly, I've been thinking about it in the context of the Venice Architecture Biennale, and you might have never heard of the Venice Architecture Biennale before. I think a lot of people haven't. I think probably more people need to know about it. And what it is basically a massive architecture festival that happens every 2 years in Venice. And in this festival, loads of people get together and they present exhibitions and they effectively look at what architecture is now, what the future of architecture is. But they always look at it in a way that has a kind of political focus, and also much more so than being focused on technology, being focused on people, and being focused on what human society needs to move forward in a kind of sustainable, progressive way. Now, the reason I'm talking about it right now is because today we had a big announcement, and the big announcement is the Venice Architecture Biennale will not happen this year, it will happen in 2021 instead. Now, obviously that's quite a big deal, and it means that some plans will have to change. But in many ways, if you think about it, if you think about an architecture festival, something that looks at all of this really important stuff, right now people are rethinking cities, they're rethinking towns, they're rethinking villages, practically rethinking places where there's hardly any people, because all of these places need to adapt and need to change, not just in the short and medium, but also in the long term, so we have the maximum resilience when it comes to crises like the one we're experiencing. So an architecture festival is a massively important thing, and to sort of add to not only is it being that important, but it has a theme. So the theme of this festival, which was chosen long before this crisis emerged by the curator Hashim Sarkis, is how do we live together? And you think, how do we live together? I mean, come on, that is the most fundamental question for cities, right? It's why we're here together. It's why we have politics. It's why we have elected leaders, because we have to sort of mediate this shared space and come to an agreement about how we live together. And these sorts of debates are massively important right now, because the mere kind of fabric, the social contract that sort of binds us together, and this spatial contract is in a state of flux. And in these states of flux is new consensus emerge. And potentially all of us are living right now through the kind of emergence of a new consensus about how space is managed. Now, with this architecture festival, it wasn't always guaranteed that it was going to be delayed, and there was a big announcements this year, and so the curator sort of fleshed out what it was all going to be about. And he gave this really good quote, and I'd like to read it word for word. And what he says is, in the context of widening political divides and growing economic inequalities, we call on architects to imagine spaces in which we can generously live together. And I think that's a really, really, really good summary, right? We need to imagine spaces in which we can generously live together. So this architecture festival is going ahead in a year's time. And I would argue that this is possibly the most important event that's going to be happening in the coming years, right? And I really think that we need as many people as possible, and certainly, any kind of elected local or central government representatives from all of the countries of the world really need to go there and engage with this idea of imagining spaces where we can generously live together, because that's exactly what we need. Now, so one of the things, the consequences is that each nation has a pavilion. And so obviously I'm chatting with you, I'm now in London, and so I'll talk a bit about the British Pavilion. So the British Pavilion is this year it was going to be curated by Unseen Architecture, which is a really cool new architecture practice set up by Madeleine Kessler and Mandajay Vergès, and they effectively are focusing on public space. Bang, the most important issue right now that everybody needs to be talking about. And I've got here a slide of the British Pavilion. It's like a beautiful old house in Venice where this exhibition will be hosted. And so there's 6 rooms in here, and Unseen Architecture had this idea of having 6 immersive spaces. So within each of these rooms, you would travel through these fantastic exhibitions that would prompt you to think and reconsider what these spaces mean. And so these spaces would look at principally public gardens, the garden square, which is a kind of thing that you see a lot in London, but also thinking of it as a park effectively, and as a place of the people, and also as a place of activism and of a centre for change. Other rooms would look at play spaces, pubs, data and photo sort of facial monitoring technology, and also common land, which is obviously a big topic because it's something which is often sold off. Now, so effectively, I would say that this is really, really, really timely content, and not only before this crisis, certainly this stuff was really what you needed to be thinking about, but also as we move through it, and the coronavirus is obviously shifting all of these things. Pubs will be different; they're closed. Play spaces are closed right now, but people need to play, and so we need to think about how those will evolve. And obviously parks, you cannot turn on a news page without seeing images of people sunbathing in parks and various kind of headlines and captions and sort of debating what it means. So this is super interesting stuff, and I would argue that this is absolutely where our political leaders need to be. And in my next slide, basically this is probably where they don't need to be in 2021. So this is the Davos Swiss ski resort, which is where every year is the World Economic Forum, which is again is a kind of festival. It's a summit. I would argue it probably focuses more on technology, possibly more kind of science focused, and there is also more and more in recent years a focus on sort of human oriented society, social issues, sustainable, equitable development. However, considering that all of the global leaders go here towards the end of January every year, for at least half a century or more, they've been doing that. We've been going this kind of direction. I would argue that maybe if they took a holiday from this place and maybe went along to the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2021, they might get some cool new ideas, and then maybe they can go back to Davos the following year, and then Venice again the following year, and there may be some cool outcomes from that. So that's my dream. But the sort of quest to reimagine spaces generously that we can all live in goes on. So here in London we had a big announcement, and something which I've mentioned before in this show is the Mayor's Street Space Scheme. So effectively, like many cities, we're looking at having to redesign our public spaces to make them more pedestrian and cyclist friendly. And so the Mayor has announced that huge areas of central London, including potentially London Bridge and Waterloo Bridge, are going to be just only for pedestrians and cyclists, with some buses and disabled access. Other areas are going to be massively improved to be better for cyclists, and other areas will see pavements widened to make it much easier for pedestrians to get around without getting too close to each other. So this is all brilliant, and this is exactly where our cities should have been going anyway. You know, this is a massive progressive leap in the kind of rebalancing of the city's public spaces. There are far more pedestrians than cars, people on foot and on bicycle, responsible for far more economic activity for all of the businesses that line the streets than are the people passing through in cars. So this all makes fair social and economic sense. What I'd say is, considering the sort of momentous leap that we're going through, the way it's being communicated is a bit lackluster, and effectively this is the only visual that was announced along with it. And so this basically just looks like a load of multicoloured spaghetti on a page. If you're a frequent cyclist or somebody who really knows the city well, you at a glance can pretty much pick out what the key routes are and what this all relates to. But this doesn't really communicate at all very well. And so I would argue, although the idea is brilliant, this visually is a bit of a flop. And I think that it comes back to what I've been saying before. We really need to harness the kind of immense design talent that exists at the fingertips in this city, and certainly we know is already engaged with the Mayor and the Transport for London, to produce these sort of visuals that capture people's imagination, but also inspire people through design to be their very best, to do their very best, and to occupy the public space, to get to work and beyond in a way that's safe and sustainable in this current crisis. And as an indication of that this is totally possible, here's a speculative proposal by an architect called Curl Lateral Head, and they have a lot of specialism in higher education, in school design, and so they're experts in this field, and effectively they've been looking at this big debate about how we reopen primary schools and eventually secondary schools. So using their expertise, using their talent as designers, but also as communicators, they've put together this proposal for effectively a kind of overspill for schools, because currently school classrooms are not big enough to have all the students 2 metres apart. So what do? You occupy spaces around schools, and traditionally that would be a playing field. In this render, they've put these tents, these sort of pop-up tents, where every kid would have enough space to be able to be educated safely in a distance from each other. They've put these tents in a street, which I think is imaginative, and I think why not? We should take over the streets. The streets are living spaces, and they are the ultimate public space. So this makes total rational sense to have these as public spaces and to use them for classrooms. I would argue this visual possibly reveals a bigger scandal, which is the selling off of the play spaces, the playing fields, and other amenities, which would actually allow schools to put these tents on their own grounds rather than having to use the street. But I have no objections to streets being used for this. I think there's perfectly possible that all these things can coexist in a safe and sustainable way. But this really shows, this is a classic, this is what Sarkis is saying in his call to architects. We need to imagine how we can live together generously. And this does that, this visual in all of these things. And it says to parents, look, this can work, right? And it says to students this can work, and it says to policymakers this can work. So this is exactly where we need to be going. So I say to the Mayor of London, check out the kind of design talent that's going on. Get some of these people to visualise how street space will work, because once we've got really cool visuals like this for street space, then there's really nothing stopping us in terms of building a really great city that's really going to capture that changing consensus right now, that's going to move us forward for decades, if not centuries, with a new settlement of how streets and other spaces can be used for everybody to create a society that really works for everyone. And I think this is a topic which, again, I would sort of transpose onto another thing which is coming up. So obviously it's the 18th of May today. In just over a month, we will be at the midsummer point, which is the summer solstice. So that's the longest day of the year, and it's celebrated all over the world, and it's particularly celebrated in this spot, Stonehenge, in Wiltshire, which is a kind of ancient, mysterious monument. If you look at where the sun rises, it's quite clearly a kind of calendar and a kind of space for measuring the passing of the years. So obviously, just like any New Year's festival, people get together on the night, the shortest night, and to celebrate the sun rising. And traditionally that's marked here with a kind of gathering, a very cordial event, which I've been to myself. And English Heritage, who are the custodians of this space, recently announced that this event won't be happening this year. And that's completely in line with pretty much every music festival, probably mostly around the world, that a lot of them have been cancelled. A lot of major public events are cancelled, so obviously this is a major public event. We still don't really have religious gatherings in churches, prayer spaces, etc. So this kind of fits with what is sensible public policy right now. But again, it provides people an opportunity to rethink how to mark this important day. And I would argue that clearly, yes, this is a kind of spiritually important space to some people, or culturally important space. But there's loads of culturally and spiritually important spaces on your doorstep. So I would implore anyone to sort of do some research about their local neighbourhood and think of a great spot where they could watch the sunrise. And as a smaller gathering, might well just be on their own or with members of their household, or with however many others are permitted when we are at that point in June. So sort of imagine how they could do that in a way. And I think this is interesting because actually normally around about the time of Stonehenge Solstice, you would also have the Glastonbury Festival. So this is quite cool aerial photograph I found, effectively a satellite image of Glastonbury, which is this enormous festival of many people. Tens of thousands, more than 100,000 people go to this festival, and effectively on a map, on an aerial photo, it looks like a kind of temporary city. And this isn't happening this year either. But I would say again, things like this can happen. We just need to reimagine how we can occupy these spaces generously together. So it's totally possible. It's a design challenge, and it could go ahead one day as the best festival ever, the best Glastonbury ever. So, with all those thoughts, I'd say, again, we're living in a time that's rapidly changing, but new consensuses are emerging. And I think those should be grounded in generosity and on imagination. So, we're going to live through an interesting time ahead of us. And thankfully, these great minds, certainly those working on the Venice Architecture Biennale, are contemplating these issues. And we'll luckily be part of these very interesting discussions and be able to witness some interesting conclusions. And I implore everyone to go along to the festival. I certainly will be in 2021. Now, do share your thoughts on what I've been discussing. It's been a great pleasure, and we'll be back again soon with more interesting topics. Thank you.